Well, today's gospel lesson comes in two parts. One having to do with the scribes and Pharisees, and the other having to do with the disciples of Jesus. And both stories have to do with you and with me. Now, we're missing the lead up to the first story involving the scribes and the Pharisees. They have asked Jesus this question: why do your disciples not wash their hands before they eat? Why do they break the tradition of the elders? And Jesus responds with a pretty deft question. And he says back to them, well, why do you break the commandments of God for the sake of your traditions? And the disciples say to him, hey, Jesus, do you realize you just offended them? An aside about this back and forth between Jesus and the Pharisees and the scribes. In first century Palestine, that's how you talked about Scripture, traditions, religion, things that matter. Arguing back and forth was not unusual. That's how you got to truth among your people. I mean, think of it kind of as a full contact Bible study. That's how they worked through questions that they all had about this God that they followed. So throughout the Gospels, we constantly see Jesus being challenged by Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes, and we can take offense at that, but actually that's how they work through questions. Jesus goes on to say to the crowd what we heard in the lesson. He says to the crowd standing there, it's not what goes into the body that defiles, but rather what comes from the heart. Jesus wants to set the scribes and Pharisees straight because they lead the people. They need to get it right. And they've been putting the traditions ahead of the very law of God, and Jesus calls them on it. He is constantly pushing them to get past their traditions and move into the heart of the law. And in the process, at times, they take offense. You know, it's actually quite difficult for them to be around Jesus. He is constantly challenging them. Next is the disciples' turn to be challenged and offended and uncomfortable. No one's off the hook when they hang around Jesus. His word is like a two-edged sword and cuts deeply to the heart of things. Jesus challenges all of us. So a Canaanite woman wants Jesus to heal her daughter, and the disciples tell her to go away. After all, she's Canaanite. She's not Israelite. She's not one of them. Jesus is their Messiah, not hers. But she persists, knowing from where her help comes. And surprisingly, Jesus heals her daughter. Now, the text doesn't say how the disciples reacted to this. That's left to our imagination. So, I imagine they were bowled over by it. I imagine they were stunned. I imagine they had a hard time with the grace of Jesus being extended in such a dramatic way to a Gentile of all people. That would not have added up for them for their worldview. Like the scribes and Pharisees, they too are taken aback by the attitudes, and teachings, and actions of Jesus. It's challenging for the disciples to be around Jesus. No one is safe when they come close to Jesus. And that holds true for us today. Many of you know that Pam and I attended the march in Charlottesville last weekend. A call had gone out hoping to raise 1,000 clergy to gather as a prayerful and nonviolent presence in the midst of the alt-right elements that gathered for that rally in the downtown park. So Pam and I went. And thankfully, we were not caught up in the violence that occurred. That Saturday morning, we gathered with clergy and other church leaders at 8 in the morning, and we walked downtown to a location where we listened for about 2 hours to speakers. We sang songs, there were prayers said, and people generally talked. And having lived in Charlottesville for many years, we saw a lot of old friends that morning. As the morning progressed, groups of alt-right marchers began streaming into the downtown area on foot. And they arrived in platoons of 15 to 20 people. They were very, very organized. They wore white shirts, khaki or black pants, combat boots. Most carried flags, Nazi flags, Confederate flags, flags with symbols on them I had never seen before. Most carried clubs and shields. Most wore helmets. Many of them carried firearms. Virginia is an open carry state, so they were legal. Menacing, but legal. Many of them carried mace and pepper spray. The police had inspected the park the night before and found a number of long knives hidden in the bushes. These groups chanted Nazi slogans like blood and soil, and you will not replace us. You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. As I watched them arriving, a bit bewildered and disbelieving, I wondered out loud, what happened to those guys? An old law school friend of mine who is African American was standing next to me, and he quipped, "Well, nothing has happened to them, Joe. Not a thing." Later, as I reflected on our exchange, I thought about how we had actually talked past one another. My friend was commenting on their cultural experience as white males. As far as he was concerned, as a person of color, nothing has ever happened to the alt-right marchers. They've never felt what it feels like to be a black person in a predominantly white culture with a history of slavery. He could not see any way the alt-right protesters have ever been an oppressed people. Nothing has ever happened to them that would give them the right to be so filled with hate. I was commenting on the condition of their hearts. All I could think was, what has happened in their hearts that they would dress up this way, come armed with clubs, and chant Nazi slogans? For me, something has happened to them. Something has hardened their hearts. Something has happened to them to pull them into a culture of hate and death. I was wondering about their souls. How did things go so horribly wrong for them? Well, these are tense and difficult times for our nation. The days ahead will be deeply challenging for all of us. And as followers of Jesus, we need to be prepared to be caught off guard by what it takes to follow Jesus. This thought came to me in a short video clip that I saw online this week. As with many of you, I'm sure, I read a whole lot this week. I watched a lot of video clips. All of the articles I read, of all of them that I read, this little clip really stood out for me. I read a lot about the alt-right. I read a lot about anti-fascists. I read a lot about neo-Nazis and KKK and militias, open carry laws, police strategies for crowd control, Confederate statues, Confederate history, statue history. But this one short video clip really stood out for me as a ray of hope and progress in a sea of confusion, anger, despair, and fear. this little clip showed a government official. For some reason, I think it was a lieutenant governor, and it wasn't Virginia. It was some other state. This government official was speaking to what appeared to be some sort of alt-right protester, one person, on the steps of a government building, maybe a state house or courthouse, I'm not sure. And surrounding them was a handful, just a small group of counter-protesters. And the government official made it very clear that he disagreed with the views of the alt-right protesters standing in front of him. But then he said this to the counter-protesters. He said, "Show this man love. Show this man love." In an instant, two concepts from Scripture came to me. Jesus commanding us to love our enemies, and then Paul reminding us that we struggle not against flesh and blood, but rather against powers and principalities. As these scriptural concepts came to mind, compassion for that alt-right protester welled up in my heart. Compassion for that man who has gone so far astray from his fellow human beings and from his God. And I was grateful to the government official for reminding me of my duty as a follower of Jesus. I was caught up short, and I began to feel a bit like the scribes and Pharisees might have felt when Jesus challenged them about leading God's people astray, or how the disciples might have felt when Jesus challenged their possessive and exclusionary attitudes about the Canaanite woman. Through that government official's plea to show that man love, Jesus pushed me to go deeper. Jesus is calling me to love the unlovable. I was also reminded that the opposite of love is not hate, but fear. At the heart of the hate and bigotry of those alt-right groups I saw on Saturday is deep, deep fear. And we, as Christians, are uniquely positioned to heal that fear. So what will healing fear like that look like over the weeks and months to come? Prayer? Reaching out? Being open to a move of God in situations that arise? Perhaps some sort of ministry initiative to hate-filled people? I don't know. All I know is that I need to be open to the move of God, wherever that might lead, as we together confront the evil power and principalities that hold fellow citizens captive to great fear. What will it look like to love the unlovable? God knows.